Hello, friends and neighbors. It's an honor to get to be on Medford Anywhere Learning TV today. And I'm Bret Champion. I'm the superintendent of schools here for the Medford School District. And we were thinking about what are some things we can do for third grade through fifth, sixth grade or such. And we hit upon the idea of actually reading some chapter books. And as we brainstormed what possibilities we might read, one that popped into my mind immediately was a book by Andrew Clements called Frindle. And so that's what I'm going to do today. I'm just going to read you from Andrew Clements' book, Frindle. So I look forward to it. There's a picture. The big idea. And by the time he had run down the street and up the steps and through the door and upstairs to his room, it wasn't just a big idea, it was a plan. A whole plan, just begging for Nick to put it into action. And action was Nick's middle name. The next day after school, the plan began. Nick walked into the penny pantry store and asked the lady behind the counter for a Frindle. She squinted at him. "A what?" "A Frindle, please. A black one," said Nick, and smiled at her. She leaned over closer and aimed one ear at him. "You want what?" "A Frindle." And this time, Nick pointed at the ballpoint pens behind her on the shelf. "A black one, please." The lady handed Nick the pen. He handed her the 49 cents, said thank you, and left the store. 6 days later, Janet stood at the counter of the penny pantry. Same store, same lady. John had come in the day before, and Pete the day before that, and Chris the day before that, and Dave the day before that. Janet was the 5th kid that Nick had sent there to ask the woman for a Frindle. And when she asked, the lady reached right for the pens and said, "Blue or black?" Nick was standing 1 aisle away at the candy racks, and he was grinning. Frindle was a real word. It meant pen. Who says Frindle means pen? You do, Nicholas. Half an hour later, a group of serious 5th graders had a meeting in Nick's playroom. It was John, Pete, Dave, Chris, and Janet. Add Nick, and that's 6 kids, 6 secret agents. They held up their right hands and read the oath Nick had written out. "From this day on and forever, I will never use the word pen again. Instead, I will use the word Frindle, and I will do everything possible so others will too." And all 6 of them signed the oath with Nick's Frindle. The plan would work. Thanks, Mrs. Granger. Chapter 7, Word Wars. School was the perfect place to launch a new word, and since this was a major historical event, Nick wanted it to begin in exactly the right class, 7th period language arts. Nick raised his hand first thing after the bell rang and said, "Mrs. Granger, I forgot my Frindle." Sitting 3 rows away, John blurted out, "I have an extra one you can borrow, Nick." Then John made a big show of looking for something in his backpack. "I think I have an extra Frindle. I told my mom to get me 3 or 4. I'm sure I had an extra Frindle in here yesterday, but I must have taken it. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, here it is." And then John made a big show of throwing it over to Nick, and Nick missed it on purpose. Then he made a big show of finding it. Mrs. Granger and every kid in the class got the message loud and clear. That black plastic thing that Nick borrowed from John had a funny name, a different name, a new name, Frindle. There was a lot of giggling, but Mrs. Granger turned up the power in her eyes and swept the room into silence, and the rest of the class went by according to plan, her plan. As everyone was leaving after class, Mrs. Granger said, "Nicholas, I'd like to have a word with you," and she emphasized the word word. Nick's mouth felt dry, and he gulped, but his mind stayed clear. He walked up to her desk. "Yes, Mrs. Granger?" "It's a funny idea, Nicholas, but I will not have my class disrupted again. Is that clear?" Her eyes were lit up, but it was mostly light, not much heat. "Idea? What idea?" asked Nick, and he tried to make his eyes as blank as possible. "You know what I mean, Nicholas. I am talking about the performance that you and John gave at the start of the class. I am talking about this." And she held up her pen, an old maroon fountain pen with a blue cap. "But I really didn't have a Frindle with me," said Nick, amazed at his own bravery. And hiding behind his glasses, Nick kept his eyes wide and blank. Mrs. Granger's eyes flashed and then narrowed, and her lips formed a thin, hard line. She was quiet for a few seconds, and then she said, "I see. Very well. Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss today, Nicholas. You may go." "Thanks, Mrs. Granger," said Nick, and he grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. And when he was just stepping into the hallway, he said, "And I promise I won't ever forget my Frindle again. Bye." This is a great book. Chapter 8, Mightier Than the Sword. 2 days later, the photographer came to take class pictures. The 5th grade picture would be taken last, right after lunch. That gave Nick and his secret agents plenty of time, and they whispered something into the ear of every 5th grader. All the individual pictures had been taken, and finally it was time for the group picture. Everyone was lined up on the auditorium stage. Everyone's hair looked great, and everyone was smiling. But when the photographer said, "Say cheese," no one did. Instead, every kid said, "Frindle," and they held one up for the camera to see. The photographer was out of film, so that shot was the only 5th grade group picture he took. 6 of the 5th grade teachers were not pleased, and Mrs. Granger was furious. No one had really wanted to make the teachers mad. It was just fun. It also got all the kids in the school talking about the new word. And when people pick up a new word, they say it all the time. The kids at Lincoln Elementary liked Nick's new word a lot, but not Mrs. Granger. The day after the class picture, she made an announcement to each of her classes, and she posted a notice on the main bulletin board by the office. "Anyone who is heard using the word Frindle instead of the word pen will stay after school and write this sentence 100 times. I am writing this punishment with a pen. Mrs. Granger." But that just made everyone want to use Nick's new word even more. Staying after school with the lone Granger became a badge of honor. There were kids in her classroom every day after school. It went on like that for a couple of weeks. One day near the end of 7th period, Mrs. Granger asked Nick to come talk to her after school. "This is not detention, Nicholas. I just want to talk." Nick was excited. It was kind of like a conference during a war. One side waves a white flag, and the generals come out and talk. General Nicholas Allen. Nick liked the sound of it. He stuck his head into Mrs. Granger's doorway after school. "You wanted to talk with me?" "Yes, Nicholas. Please come in and sit down." When he was settled, she looked up at him and said, "Don't you think this Frindle business has gone far enough? It's just a disruption to the school, don't you think?" Nick swallowed hard, but said, "I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just fun, and it really is a real word. It's not a bad word, just different. And besides, it's how words really change, isn't it? That's what you said." Mrs. Granger sighed. "It is how a word could be made up brand new, I suppose, but the word pen? Should it really be replaced by that other word? The word pen has a long, rich history. It comes from the Latin word for feather, pinna. It started to become our word pen because quills made from feathers were some of the first writing tools ever made. It's a word that comes from somewhere. It makes sense, Nicholas." "But Frindle makes just as much sense to me," said Nick. "And after all, didn't somebody just make up the word pinna, too?" That got a spark from Mrs. Granger's eyes, but all she said was, "Then you are not going to stop this?" And Nick looked right in her eyes and said, "Well, I mean, a bunch of my friends and I took an oath about using the word, and we have to keep our promise. And besides, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I like my word." Nick tried to look brave, like a good general should. "Very well, then. I thought it would end up this way." Mrs. Granger pulled a fat white envelope from her desk drawer and held it up. "This is a letter I have written to you, Nicholas." Nick held out his hand, thinking she was going to give it to him, but she didn't. "I am not going to send it to you until all this is over. I want you to sign your name and put today's date across the back of the envelope. When you read it, whenever that may be, you will know it is the same letter and that I have not made any changes to it." "This is weird," Nick said to himself. But to Mrs. Granger he said, "Sure," and he signed his name in his best cursive and put the date under it. And there's a picture like a conference during a war. Then Mrs. Granger stood up abruptly and said, "Then that is all for today, Nicholas, and may the best word win." There was a frown on her face, but her eyes were different, almost happy. And Nick was halfway down the hall before it hit him. She likes this war, and she wants to win real bad. Walking to school the next day, Pete had a great idea. "How about we see if we can get every kid in the whole 5th grade to go up and ask Mrs. Granger, 'Can I borrow a Frindle?'" "You mean, Mrs. Granger, may I borrow a Frindle?" said Dave. Got to use good grammar. Don't want to upset dangerous Grangeress. Sounds good to me, said Nick. She can't keep everyone after school, can she? Almost 80 kids stayed after school with Mrs. Granger that day. They filled her room and spilled out into the hallway. The principal had to stay late to help, and they had to arrange 2 special late buses to get all the kids home. And the next day, all the 5th graders did it again, and so did a lot of other students. Over 200 kids. Parents called to complain. The school bus drivers threatened to go on strike. And then the school board and the superintendent got involved. And about this time, the principal of Lincoln Elementary School paid a little visit to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Allen. She wanted to talk to them about their son, the one in 5th grade, the one named Nick. Chapter 9, Chess. Mrs. Margaret Chatham had been principal of Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School was torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Mrs. Chatham had asked Nick to be there too. It was 6:30 when she knocked, and Nick opened the door. "Good evening, Nick," she said, no smile. "Hi, Mrs. Chatham," said Nick, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would play linebacker on a football team because that's what his dad had played in college. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen," she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a long black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it into her left pocket. She shook hands stiffly with both of Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat on the rocking chair that faced Mrs. Chatham across the low coffee table. "This is not an easy visit for me. We're having some trouble at school, and it appears that Nick is in the middle of it." Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chatham laid out the story as she saw it, Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined 5th grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at school, with no one respecting the rules anymore. Nick watched his mom and dad while Mrs. Chatham talked, looking from one face to another. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Mrs. Chatham finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. Doesn't all this seem like a lot of fuss about something pretty silly?" Nick sat quietly, but in his mind he shouted, "Hurrah for Mom! Hurrah for mothers everywhere!" His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chatham. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allen was still talking to the principal. "I mean, is there really any harm in the children making up a funny word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used?" Mrs. Chatham sighed and said, "Yes, I suppose it does seem silly, but Mrs. Granger thinks that it's rather like keeping children from saying ain't. There have to be standards. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself, it's the lack of respect for authority." Mr. Allen said, "Well, Mrs. Granger's right about that. There have to be standards. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we?" And that's when Nick piped in. "You know that big dictionary in Mrs. Granger's room? The word ain't is right there in the book. I looked it up, and there it was. I don't see why I can't use a word if it's in the dictionary. Mrs. Granger even said that her big dictionary was the law." Nick looked from face to face to face. That stumped them all. He had just launched a first-class thought grenade. "Well, yes, but, as I said, the word ain't and even the word Frindle, these are not the real issue here," said Mrs. Chatham. Mrs. Allen said, "Well, I think the real issue is Mrs. Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. It's an overreaction. Don't you think so, Tom?" And Mrs. Allen looked at her husband. It was Mr. Allen's turn to look from face to face to face. He was lost. Yeah, well, sure, I guess so. I mean, it's not like anybody's been hurt. I mean, it's not like vandalism or stealing or something like that." His sentence trailed off, and he rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully through the window on the wall behind Mrs. Chatham. And while the 3 grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what was really going on here. It was a chess game. Nick against Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger had just tried to end the game by using her queen, Mrs. Chatham, in her black raincoat, the Black Queen. Nick didn't know it until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own. Good old Mom, the White Queen, and the game was not over. It would go on until there was a winner and a loser. Mrs. Chatham didn't stay much longer. There was a little more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how children have a right to explore new ideas, about the importance of respecting teachers and the work they do, about everybody needing to keep up standards and make school a safe place to learn. Then Mr. Allen offered Mrs. Chatham some coffee and banana bread, but she said, "No thanks. I really must be going now." She thanked Nick's parents, and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, "Good night, Mrs. Chatham." Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. "Nick, I think we'd better talk a little more about this," said his mom, sitting back down on the couch. "If I find out that you have been disrespectful to Mrs. Granger or any other teacher at school, then you really will be in big trouble." "I haven't been disrespectful, honest. I did get everybody started using my word, but like you said, it's not hurting anybody. And I'm sorry if me and Dave and Pete got everybody to ask Mrs. Granger to borrow a Frindle. That was mean, I guess. But she started it by making kids stay after school and write 100 sentences just for saying my word once. All the kids like to use my word. It's just fun, that's all." "Well," said Nick's dad, "if it gets everyone upset and makes the principal come talk to your mother and me, then it must not be fun for everybody, is it? And I think you should just tell all your friends to knock it off right now. I mean, tomorrow." Nick shook his head. "I can't, Dad. It won't work. It's a real word now. It used to be just mine, but not anymore. If I knew how to stop it, I think I probably would, but I can't." And Nick looked at both of their faces to see if that idea was sinking in. It was. "Like I said, I won't be disrespectful, but I do like my word, and I guess now we're just going to have to see what happens." And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, had to agree. The game would go on. Chapter 10, Freedom of the Press. Judy Morgan was a reporter for the Westfield Gazette, the local newspaper. Westfield was a quiet little town. There was the occasional burglary, the teenagers got rowdy once in a while, and there was some shouting at the town council or the planning board now and then. But mostly, things were calm and orderly in Westfield, and every Thursday, the Westfield Gazette proved it. Ted Bell sold advertisements for the paper, and he had a daughter in 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. He told Judy that a bunch of 5th graders were making trouble and were not obeying teachers anymore, that there was something about a secret code word they were all using. And half the students had been kept after school one day last week, including his own little girl. The only other story Judy was working on was about 18 new trees that were going to be planted along East Main Street. The trees could wait. This thing at the elementary school sounded like a real story. So Judy Morgan showed up at Lincoln Elementary School at 3 o'clock the day after Mrs. Chatham had been to visit Nick's parents. The sign on the door read, "All visitors must report to the office," and so she did. On the bulletin board outside the office, Judy saw Mrs. Granger's notice about the punishment for using the word Frindle. She stepped back 2 spaces, aimed her camera at the notice, and snapped a photo. She read the notice once more and then stepped into the office. Mrs. Freed, the school secretary, looked up and smiled. "May I help you?" "Yes, I'm sure you can. My name is Judy Morgan, and I work for the Westfield Gazette. I'd like to know about the poster outside the office, the one about this word Frindle. Who should I talk to?" Mrs. Freed stopped smiling. She was sick and tired of anything to do with that word. For the past week, her phone had been ringing off the hook. If it wasn't a parent complaining about a child who had to stay after school, it was someone from the school board trying to get in touch with Mrs. Chatham or Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Freed pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. She said, "You'll have to speak with the principal. Let me see if Mrs. Chatham is free." She was. There isn't a principal alive who won't find the time to talk to someone from the local newspaper. The reporter was invited into Mrs. Chatham's office. Judy noticed right away that the principal was not comfortable talking about this stuff. When asked about the poster outside the office door, Mrs. Chatham laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's nothing, really. Some kids have been playing a prank, and it was time to put a stop to it." The principal's laugh sounded phony to Judy Morgan. "And did that notice put an end to the prank? I heard that a lot of children were kept after school last week. Would you tell me a little about that? Parents would like to know what's going on." Mrs. Chatham looked like a kid who had been sent to the principal's office. She squirmed a little in her chair and tried to smile, and she said, "Well, we do still have a little problem, but it's under control. Mrs. Granger may have overreacted a bit. I don't think the children have really been trying to be disrespectful. They are just having some fun, and it's more like a difference of opinion." And then Mrs. Chatham went on to tell the reporter what she knew about the word Frindle and how it had become popular among the students. Judy Morgan took careful notes. And when the principal had finished, Judy said, "Would you mind if I asked Mrs. Granger a few questions?" Mrs. Chatham said, "No, not at all." But Judy could tell that the principal wished she would just go away. What could she say, though? Mrs. Chatham couldn't very well keep the reporter away from Mrs. Granger because, after all, America is a free country with a free press. If Judy really wanted to, she could talk to Mrs. Granger sooner or later. And it was sooner. In 3 minutes, Judy Morgan was standing at the doorway of room 12, looking in at Mrs. Granger. There were about 15 children sitting at desks scattered around the room, busy writing out their 100 sentences. She knocked, and the teacher and students looked up from their work. "I'm Judy Morgan from the Westfield Gazette, Mrs. Granger. May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Granger stood and came out into the hallway and closed the door. Judy could see past her and saw that every kid in the room was straining to listen. Judy noticed Mrs. Granger's eyes right away, gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp, but not hard or mean, just bright and strong. The reporter didn't waste words. "So I hear that you plan to stop the students from using their new word. How goes the battle?" Mrs. Granger did not smile, and her eyes got even brighter. "First of all, it is not a battle. I am merely helping my students to see that this foolishness should stop. Such a waste of time and thought. There is no reason to invent a new and useless word. They should each learn to use the words we already have. But of course, all of this is just a silly fad, and when you add an E to fad, you get fade. And I predict that this fad will fade." Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, "Any idea how it all got started?" Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch on fire at that question, and she said, "Yes, I have a very good idea how it all got started. It was one young man's idea, a fifth-grade student named Nicholas Allen. And now you will have to excuse me, Mrs. Morgan, for I have papers I must grade." And with a brief, firm handshake, Mrs. Granger ended the interview. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on a bench outside the office so she could look over her notes to make sure they made sense. It took her about 5 minutes. Then Judy stood up, put her notebook into her large black purse, waved goodbye to a frowning Mrs. Freed, and headed out the door. As she walked to the parking lot, 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out another door. Judy walked beside them, listening to them laugh and joke. Then she asked them, "Why do you kids keep saying Frindle? Don't you hate staying after school?" A boy who was almost falling over from the weight of his backpack looked up at her and smiled. "It's not so bad. There's always a bunch of my friends there. I've written that sentence 600 times now." And then the kids said Mrs. Granger didn't even look at their punishment papers anymore. They were sure, because where you were supposed to write, "I am writing this punishment with a pen," everyone was writing the word Frindle every 4th or 5th sentence, and Mrs. Granger hadn't said anything. One girl bragged that she had written the word Frindle 45 times on her sheets today. She grinned and said, "That's a new record." "And this boy named Nick," Judy asked, "has he had to stay after school too?" The kids giggled, and a tall boy with reddish-brown hair and glasses said, "Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks she wants to adopt him." The reporter smiled and said, "Do you think I could find Nick and talk to him this afternoon?" The boy looked at Judy for a second and then said, "I don't think Nick would want to talk to you right now. He might say something stupid and get himself in trouble." Then he grinned at his friends. The kids laughed and poked and punched each other and headed off down the block. Judy drove back to her office and started writing. There's a picture with the word Frindle in there. The next morning, a brown envelope arrived at the Gazette addressed to Judy Morgan, and below her name was written Frindle Story. When Judy opened it, there was a class picture, the fifth grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Mrs. Granger and the 6 other teachers were standing at the ends of the rows, and the kids were dressed neatly, hair all combed, but there was something odd about the picture. The reporter looked closely and saw that each kid was holding up a pen, and each little mouth was puckered in the same way. She was puzzled for a second, but then she said softly, "Of course, they're all saying Frindle." Written on the back of the picture in neat cursive was, "3rd row, 5th from the left." Judy looked at the picture, and there she saw the same grinning red-haired boy with glasses that she had talked to in the school parking lot yesterday. She chuckled and said, "Well, well, well. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Nicholas Allen." Chapter 11. Extra, extra, read all about it. On Thursday morning, the Westfield Gazette was delivered to all 12,297 homes and post office boxes in Westfield. The story about Lincoln Elementary was the first item on the front page, and the headline, Local fifth grader says, "Move over, Mr. Webster." It was quite an article. Not that Judy Morgan didn't tell the truth. Every statement in the article was completely true. It was the particular way she told the truth that got things hopping around town. For example, take this sentence about Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger, champion of the forces of order and authority, is battling hundreds of young Frindle fighters. Neither side is giving in. Or this bit about Nick. Everyone agrees that Nick Allen masterminded this plot that cleverly raises issues about free speech and academic rules. He's the boy who invented the new word. Or this last sentence in the article. One thing is sure. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School love their Frindles, and no one seems to be backing off in this war of the words. And, of course, the Westfield Gazette published the class picture, too, and Mrs. Granger and Nick were identified for all the world to see. "What is the meaning of this?" That's what Nick's mother said, putting the article in front of Nick's nose when he got home from school. "Did you talk to this reporter? She seems to know an awful lot about you and your new word, young man." "What is the meaning of this?" That's what the school superintendent said to Mrs. Chatham, slapping a copy of the article onto her desk. "Why did you have to talk to that reporter? Don't we have enough trouble getting the taxpayers to pay for the schools without articles like this banging around town?" "What is the meaning of this?" That's what Mrs. Chatham said to Mrs. Granger, shaking the newspaper in front of her face. "I know you had to talk to that woman, but did you have to say all these things? It'll be a wonder if we don't all get fired." It was quite a Thursday for everyone, and no one could figure out how Judy Morgan had gotten that fifth grade class picture. Chapter 12. Airwaves. Within a week after the article was published in the Westfield Gazette, the kids at the junior high and the kids at the high school had stopped using the word pen and had started using the word Frindle. They loved it. Nick became sort of a hero for kids all over town, and he quickly learned that being a hero, even if you're only a local hero, isn't a free ride. It has a price. People noticed Nick when he walked into his dad's hardware store or when he stood in line at the penny pantry to buy a candy bar. He could feel it when someone recognized him, and it made him shy and awkward. Kids at school started expecting him to be clever and funny all the time, and even for a kid as smart as Nick, that was asking a lot. Every teacher, the office secretary, the principal, even the school nurse and the custodian, all seemed to be watching, always watching. His parents were great about everything. True, his mom had been upset when the article first came out, and so had his dad. Nick had said, "But I didn't do anything wrong, Mom, and neither did that lady from the newspaper." And his parents could see that he was right. The things in the article were true, and the truth is the truth, and nothing could be done about it now. Even though it made them uncomfortable to have their boy talked about all over town, secretly, Nick's mom and dad were pleased. After all, a brand new word is a pretty amazing thing. Their Nicholas was quite a fellow. No getting around it. Someone else in town thought this brand new word was pretty amazing too. Bud Lawrence had lived all his life in Westfield, and when he was only 19 years old, he had saved enough money to make an investment. He looked around for a good idea and then bought the first Dairy Queen in the state. After a few years, he bought a McDonald's restaurant. That was almost 30 years ago, and these two restaurants had made him rich, one of Westfield's leading citizens. When Bud Lawrence saw the article about the new word, he had his lawyer file a preliminary trademark claim on the word Frindle. Within 4 days, he had set up a small company that was selling cheap plastic ballpoint pens specially imprinted with the word Frindle. He sold 3,000 Frindles the first week, and they sold so fast that stores all over Westfield couldn't keep them in stock. Then just as quickly, kids stopped asking for Frindles. The sales slowed down, and Bud Lawrence started thinking about other projects. A week later, it was Halloween. The leaves started falling, and it seemed like the town was going to quiet down. And it would have. If it hadn't been for Alice Lunderson. Alice lived in Betherly, a town 7 miles away from Westfield, and she worked part-time for the local CBS TV station in Carrington, a town of about 75,500 people. When there was important area news, disasters like floods or tornadoes, or sometimes if she came across little stories that seemed cute or original, Alice would call the station news manager in Carrington. If it was a good story, if it was a day when not much else was happening in the world, then the TV station would send out a van with a camera crew to shoot some videotape. Alice subscribed to all the small-town newspapers in the area to keep up with local events. Most of them were published on Thursday, and they arrived at her house by Monday or Tuesday. Then it took her a day or so to look through them all. On Wednesday morning, she finally saw the article in the Westfield Gazette about the word war. She read it through twice and looked carefully at the class photograph. She was sure that this story was a winner. Thanks for tuning in to Medford Anywhere Learning TV. Medford School District is a place where all are learning, and learning is for all.